Welcome to all of you this evening. I'm so happy you could come out and join me and Yascha Mounk, who's been traveling quite extensively these days to really raise the warning and perhaps give us some solutions regarding the rise of populism. His new book, which is called The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It, is in fact a book that looks at the trends that we are all witnessing these days, whether they're in the United States or in other parts of the world. And while we're able to get a regular daily update on the ephemeral issues of what it is that's happening out there politically with this rise of populism, what Yascha has done is take a look at the broader picture and the trends of how this populism is affecting our political systems, and most importantly, how it is affecting what we hold so dearly here in the United States as the oldest and most longest running democracy in the world, those liberal values that adhere, that really define our democracy. And I think one of the things that I'd like to talk about at first, because it's so key to an understanding of what's at threat, are the question, is the definition of what these liberal values are. When we think about liberalism, some people think, oh, well, you're a liberal versus a conservative. This is something much more fundamental. And for me, I would just sort of characterize it in a simple way, but I'd let you give us a bit more, a little more in-depth understanding of what it is. It's, in one way, majority rule, but minority rights. And of course, there's much more complexity to it than that, but in a very simple way, I think that characterizes how we consider liberal democracies. So welcome. Maybe we can talk about that particular definition at first, and then we'll take a deeper dive into these trends of rising populism around the world.
Sure, thanks. It's a real privilege to be here. That's right. I mean, I think it's worth remembering what it is that our political system is actually trying to achieve. Why have we chosen these particular sets of institutions? What are they meant to deliver? And I think two of the key aspirations that you see in the documents of the Founding Fathers, that you see in our political discourse today, that you see in many other countries that have similar political forms as well, is on the one hand individual freedom, and on the other hand some form of collective self-rule. And those are the two elements of our political system, the liberal system and the democratic element. So when I talk about the liberal element, I don't talk about liberal and conservative in the sense that I mean George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan are as much liberals as Barack Obama or Bill Clinton. And what they have in common is a commitment to a political system in which we can say what we want to say or not say, in which we can worship in the ways we choose to or not worship at all, in which we can decide how we lead our lives. And in order to sustain that over time, you need individual rights, you need to respect the rights of minorities, even when they're unpopular in various ways, and you also need the separation of powers and the rule of law, because otherwise whoever happens to be in power at that time can say, I don't like that guy, I'm going to throw him in prison. So that's the first element. But I think we also have to think of a second element, which is the democratic element. So democracy means the rule of the demos, the rule of the people. And I think once you've sort of thought about the liberal element a little bit separately, you can recognize that it requires, at the very least, actually translating popular views into public policies. We are only truly a democracy if the political system actually is able to respond to our political preferences. And those are the two things that our political system is trying to do at the same time. And what I argue in my book, The People versus Democracy, is that it is doing a less and less good job of holding those two things together. But we're starting to see those two elements drift apart.
Right, and this comes at a time which is not too long after we saw this rapid rise of liberal democracy, and I would point to the era of the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe at the end of 1989 and into 91 with the demise of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We saw what was really a rapid growth in liberal democracy. So both liberalism and democratic governance in countries at a very fast clip. But what we're now seeing is what I think my colleague Larry Diamond at the Hoover Institution calls a recession, a democratic recession. So we're actually seeing backsliding and the loss of either the liberal aspect or the democratic, or in some cases, both. What is this what you've been observing? Is this what's brought you to write this book?
Yeah, I think that what I'm observing goes beyond that, actually, right? So what Larry Diamond points out quite rightly is this democratic recession, which means that organizations like Freedom House, which measure how democratic a country is, and they do that every year, have a great database of the fate of democracy around the world. And as you're saying, you saw this huge expansion after 1989, and now a lot of those democracies are making real steps backward. And so for the last 12 years, in each year, more countries moved away from democracy than moved towards it. That is very worrying and very concerning. But I actually think that that underplays just how worried we should be right now. Because what most of us, I think, most journalists, most political scientists, most ordinary citizens believed for a long time was that, sure, there are some democracies that are quite young, that are fledgling, that are in poor countries, that don't have a deep democratic tradition, where it's going to be difficult for democracy to survive. Kenya at the moment is struggling for its democracy to survive, and that is tragic because it's an important country, but it's not that surprising. We knew that there would be some authoritarian countries, some autocratic countries, where democracy might never come, where a dictator might survive for a very long time. But we assumed that there was a core set of countries where democracy was safe. Countries like the United States, countries like Germany, where I grew up, countries like Sweden, countries in the language of political science that had changed governments for free and fair elections more than a couple of times, and that had a GDP per capita of more than about $14,000 in today's terms. Now, if all of the democracies that are backsliding were the different kinds, relatively poor democracies, relatively recent democracies, I would be less worried. But what we're actually seeing is that even countries like Hungary, which you know well because you lived there, your wife was ambassador there, that have had 2 changes of government for free and fair elections, that do have a GDP per capita of over $14,000. Even in those countries, democracy is now at threat. In the case of Hungary, I would say that as of a few weeks ago, it is no longer a truly democratic country. And that actually calls in doubt the very fundamentals of how we used to see the world. That there's a region of a world in which we can be sure that democracy will persist. And over time, hopefully, other countries will join that fold of a democratic heartland, and so the future looks pretty bright. I no longer think that we can assume that.
Right, and so we're looking, and you bring up Hungary, and indeed I did live there for almost 4 years, and I covered the region between '89 and '92 for Newsweek. During my time there was during the rise of Viktor Orban, who had come into power through free and fair elections. He won a 2/3 supermajority in the popular vote, and of course was immediately able to do essentially anything he wanted. He won democratically in elections, but he set in motion quite autocratic goals, attempting to slow down the freedom of the press quite effectively, I might add. Looking to be able to corral the judiciary and apply those who, and appoint those who would be supportive of his plans and his movement. And of course, the ability to then control some of the economic aspects of the country by making sure that contracts were going to those who were supportive of his political party and of him personally. So what we're seeing are really aspects of these countries, and Viktor Orban refers to this as an illiberal democracy. We're seeing that there are certain qualities and that carry over, not just that carry over to multiple countries. In other words, press freedoms get taken care of, judiciary gets taken care of, and some of the economic issues get taken care of. Have you noticed that there are other aspects that carry over between these countries that are backsliding democratically?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's at this point an authoritarian playbook and there's a populist playbook for how you take over democracies, right? I think sometimes people want to sound the alarm about how much danger we are in, also in the United States today, and they do that by comparisons with, say, the 1930s. And I don't think that those are very helpful, because if you think that democracy only perishes when there's people in, big, black, shiny boots marching through the streets with torches and performing, Hitler salutes, then you're going to look out the window and say, you know what, that's not going on, so perhaps everything is fine. Why is everybody worried? Well, when you look around the world today, when you look at countries like Hungary, when you look at what happened in Russia and Turkey over the past years, that's not how democracies are submerged today. It is rather by figures who we can rightly call populists. So what do I mean by a populist? All of the people we call populists, from Donald Trump here to Viktor Orban in Hungary to Recep Erdogan in Turkey to somebody like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, don't seem to have a ton in common. You may have noticed that our president doesn't appear to be overly fond of Muslims. The president of Turkey, Recep Erdogan, doesn't appear to be overly fond of anybody who's not a Muslim. So they don't have that in common. You have some populists who are very right-wing on the economy, who want to slash taxes for corporations and hand out presents to special interest groups, cut down the welfare state. There are others, like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who did the opposite, who attacked businesses and tried to expand in certain ways the welfare state. So they don't have that in common. Well, what do they have in common? A political imagination and vocabulary. What they all do is to claim that the only reason why we have any political problems whatsoever at the moment is that the political elite is corrupt and self-serving, but they care more about minorities than they do about people, quote unquote, like you and me. And so the promise they make is that once somebody actually gives voice to common sense, once somebody truly speaks for the people, everything is going to get better. I am your voice, Donald Trump said at the Republican National Convention. And part of that claim is that he alone legitimately represents the people. That anybody who disagrees with him is by that very nature illegitimate. Now, once people like that take power, they have a problem, which is that they can't deliver on those promises that they made. Right? They made hugely outsized promises. So some of them end up being so open-hearted as to say things like, who knew that things could be so complicated? Mm-hmm. Who knew that healthcare could be so complicated? I feel like in a few weeks we might hear our president say, who knew that negotiating with Kim Jong-un might turn out to be complicated? But of course they don't actually want to admit that they overpromised, and so they start to blame. They start to blame the opposition because they don't recognize that that's a legitimate activity. They say they are traitors for disagreeing with the president or the prime minister. They start to blame independent media outlets because they say that those are purveyors of fake news and they need to be regulated or registered as lobbyists or as foreign agents. They attack independent institutions, whether it's the judiciary, whether it's institutions like the FBI or the Department of Justice, because those are enemies of the people. And you're absolutely right that that pattern is the same in the United States as it is in Venezuela, as it is in Hungary.
But you've identified clearly some very unsettling patterns for how a populist rises. And as you look across the world, you've chosen some interesting examples here. We now see that populists have risen in multiple countries that we imagined would never have that form of leadership, whether it be in the United States or in other parts of Europe, Italy, Sweden, Germany. And so as you look across the sweep of the world, is this now coming to, has it run its course? Or are you observing a certain number of countries where you now see even this picking up, that there are a number of new nations that you've seen who are recognizing the power of this populist message and this ability to deliver it because of whatever new communication structures exist around the world, that we should be monitoring and maybe even doing something about it ahead of time, and before we can, while at the same time trying to deal with the populist governments that we have and the populist leaders that we already have voted in.
So look, Donald Trump is such a shiny object, and he draws so much attention to himself that for especially American audiences, it's easy to start to assume that this is really something about this one bizarre character and the charisma he has, the influence he has. But when you look beyond the United States, it's quite clear that that's not the case, right? So in Europe, for example, the average vote share of populist parties in elections was 8% in the year 2000. It is now 25%. If you remember Winston Churchill's famous speech, he warned that from Stettin in the north of Europe to Trieste in the south, an iron curtain was descending throughout the middle of a continent. Well, you can now drive from Stettin in the Baltic Sea, even further south than Trieste, to Athens in the Aegean, and never leave a country ruled by populists. In Western Europe, there aren't many outright populist governments yet, though there are some in Austria and probably soon in Italy. But in many other countries, populists are rapidly rising as well. And I often get the question that you're posing, which is, well, aren't there some countries that are immune? Aren't there some countries where everything is fine? And often the country that people propose has a name, which is not too far from here, and it's Canada. Well, I'll tell you one country where I didn't get that question.
Canada?
In Canada. Because if you remember the mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford, who you may know from such hits as smoking a crack pipe from camera while he was mayor, he was a populist of sorts, and his brother, Doug Ford, has recently become the leader of a Conservative Party in Ontario, the most important province in the country, and is likely to be its next premier. So this is happening everywhere.
Right. So so no one is immune. It can happen anywhere. It's a very simple playbook. All you need is a charismatic leader, someone who can deliver this type of message. We clearly have the infrastructure to deliver those messages that are no longer monopolized by large media organizations because of the collapse of their business model. And that's very disturbing.
It is.
So the question then is, how do we reverse some of this, or how do we, I guess there are two questions really. One is, how do we get to this point where we're no longer able to recognize this rise? Because I think this is a much more recent development that we're seeing. I mean, as I said, when we look back to 1989, it did not seem as though populism was what was going to be dominant. It seemed like it was something else that was occurring. It was sort of a liberation of sorts, a liberal liberation, democratic liberation that was occurring throughout the world, and that was catching fire and spreading. But in the intervening years, it seems that we've become more susceptible as a society to a populist, and perhaps this is a cyclical thing. But I know that you've been doing research on this, so maybe you can point out what it is that's made us more vulnerable.
Yeah, so first of all, there's no evidence that it's a cyclical thing. I mean, we haven't had a set of phenomena like that before. It really is, I think, something quite new, at least in North America and Western Europe. You've had populists, briefly becoming, for example, the governor of Louisiana, 60 or 70 years ago. But you've never seen it at the national level in this way, and you've never seen it rise at the same time in so many different countries at the same time. So I don't think that we can sort of assume, oh, it'll go away again. It might do, but there's no reason to assume that. So if we want to understand how it is that these countries were so stable for 40 or 50 years, and why suddenly they seem to be a lot less stable and people start to vote for these much more extreme figures. If we want to understand also, as I show in my book, that why it is that so many people are falling out of love with democracy, why it is that people now give less importance to living in a democracy, are more open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy than they were 20 or 30 years ago. I think we have to look at some of those long-term factors. It's not about something that happened today. It's not about something that happened only in one country. It has to be a set of factors that apply to many different countries and have been at work for a number of decades at least. And it seems to me that there's three obvious candidates here. The first is a stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens. When you think of the United States, the living standard of an average American doubled from 1935 to 1960. It doubled again from 1960 to 1985.
And then what happened?
And then it has been stagnant since.
Right.
There's basically not been an improvement in how average Americans do for the last 30 years.
Right, that's nearly 2 generations.
It's a long time, and it really changes how people think about politics.
Right.
They used to say, you know what, do I love politicians? Do I think that they're paragons of moral virtue? Do I completely trust them? No. But I'm doing twice as well as my parents did. My kids are probably going to do twice as well as me. Let's give them the benefit of a doubt.
Right. So first is economic stagnation.
Right. Because now what people are saying is quite different, right? Now they're saying, you know what, I've worked hard all my life. I don't have much to show for it. My kids are probably going to do worse than me. So let's really try something new. How bad could things get? Right? And by the way, while it's not true that the poorest people necessarily voted for Donald Trump and the most affluent people voted for Hillary Clinton, which is sometimes used as a reason to dismiss this kind of economic argument, there's a very clear geographic pattern to the support for populists. So Donald Trump won 2/3 of American counties, but only a little more than 1/3 of America's GDP. He did best in parts of a country in which there's been less recent economic investment, in which there's fewer highly qualified people, even in which the share of jobs that might be automated away is much higher. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which goes together with that, it's not in competition with that explanation, but actually goes together with that, is the ethnic and demographic transformation that we've had. In most countries in the world, most democracies in the world, democracy was founded on a mono-ethnic, monocultural conception of a nation. If you go back to 1960 and you talk to somebody in Sweden, in Italy, in Austria, and you ask them who really belongs to your country, the answer would have been relatively obvious, straightforward. It would have been, well, somebody who's ethnically descended from the same group as me.
Yes.
Now, for the last 50 or 60 years, these countries have experienced quite a lot of immigration, and that conception has started to change. There's now parts of the population there who say, yeah, of course, somebody who's brown or black, somebody who's Hindu or Muslim, or for that matter Jewish, can be a true Swede or Austrian or Italian. But there's also a lot of people who rebel against it, who don't accept that, who perhaps clung to the sense that they were somehow special because they descended from a particular ethnic group, but they were better than people in other countries, they're better than immigrants who were coming in, they more truly belonged, and they don't want to give up some of those advantages that come with that.
Right, so the globalization of people, really, the fact that we now have immigrants and that there are new ethnic groups that are moving into these countries. I remember when I lived in Germany, there was actually a definition of what a German could be defined on your bloodline.
Absolutely. So in Germany, it used to be the case that you could only become a German either by descent or by marrying a German. But if you moved to the country legally and worked for decades, you could never become a German. Right. Now, the story in the United States and in Canada, by the way, is both similar and different. It's different in the obvious sense that we've always been a multi-ethnic society. But it's similar in that there was one ethnic and religious group that have huge advantages over others. And we should remember, by the way, how far we've come in overcoming that. I think there's no doubt in my mind that it's better to be a member of just about any minority group in the United States today than it would have been 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. And we should celebrate that. Perhaps not 2 years ago, but certainly 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. But again, there's a lot of people who have to give something up as a result. And it shouldn't surprise us that some of them are upset about that and pushing against that. Now, if you have the set of economic reasons as an explanation for why people don't trust the government in the way they used to, that they don't have that bottom line sense that the political elites in the end are going to deliver for them, if that often takes that form of a sort of cultural backlash against minority groups, against immigration, social media is the last element that really makes this cocktail quite explosive.
I see. So you got the economic aspect, you then have this ethnic, racial element, and then you've got the ability to amplify both of these realities and really put them over the top.
Exactly. Because 25 years ago you had a media ecosystem, and you're a journalist for a long time, so so you know that, in which a few big institutions could sort of decide what was part of a national discourse. If you wanted to spread your views to your fellow citizens, you had to either own a big network, radio station, publishing house, newspaper, or you had to be allowed to take that platform by those owners. Now that was in some ways quite good, because it made it more difficult for very extreme voices to influence our politics. It was also quite bad because it marginalized certain people who really could add something to the conversation. Well, over the last 20, 30 years, that's given away. With the rise of the internet, it became possible for anybody to spread their views around the world. You could make a website practically free of charge, and anybody could come and access it. But people still didn't necessarily come to joeblogs.com, right? There's no reason to go to it, you might not know about it. And that's where social media comes in. Because suddenly, anybody can be a broadcaster. Even if you only have a few dozen friends on Facebook or 100 followers on Twitter, if you take a particularly cute video of your cat, or if you are sitting on a United Airlines flight and somebody decides to re-accommodate you, and you share that video with your followers, within a couple of hours, millions of people might see it. And again, that has some advantages. In dictatorships, it means that the democratic opposition can now point out some of the failings of a regime, some of the ways in which it's corrupt. In our societies, it amplifies some important voices as well. Think of the brave students at Parkland High in Florida who've really entered our national conversation very quickly because of social media. But in a moment in which people are already mistrustful of institutions, angry at the government, in a moment in which a lot of people are in the midst of a sort of cultural backlash against the idea of an equal multi-ethnic society, it also makes it easy for hatred to spread, for fake news to spread, and for extremists to organize themselves politically.
So that's a pretty, out of those three elements, it seems that the last two are the ones that have really accelerated. I mean, economically, you could have periods of economic uncertainty and of rising and falling, and something that could be much more cyclical. But the globalization has really accelerated, obviously, because of airline travel and borders and creation of unions such as the European Union. And of course, the social media, internet aspect is entirely new. And so you're, just to repeat what you've already said, you're looking at these three elements as being the perfect storm for allowing those populist elements that may have always existed within our societies to finally break through and break out, and in that sense win elections in these countries that we're looking at.
Yeah, and I think all of them are new in certain ways, by the way. I mean, all through the history of democratic stability, most citizens had real improvements in their living standards. It used to be that 90% of Americans by the age of 30 could say that they earned more than their parents had at the same age, right? Now, if you reverse that, that means that only for 10% of Americans was it the case that they hadn't experienced a real improvement in their living standards over the course of their own lives. Now it's 50%. So half of people who are 30 years old today look back at their childhood and say, well, my parents were doing better than I am. When they were 30, they were doing better than I am, right?
Right.
That's a real transformation in how people think about this. And so to deal with populism, it's not just a matter of standing up to the authoritarian instincts of governments like that we see in Hungary, like that, for that matter, that we see closer to home in the United States. It's not just a matter of trying to rein in excesses of power. It's also a matter of actually counteracting some of those more structural, long-term drivers of populism, right? It's not enough to win against a particular candidate. You have to eradicate the conditions that made it possible for them to rise. And that means, at the very least, that we have to show people that, yes, it's an age of globalization, and there's nothing we can do about that exactly. We're not going to reverse globalization. And by the way, when you look at how many billions of people have been lifted out of poverty around the world for the last couple of decades, we probably shouldn't. But we can do much more to ensure that the fruits of globalization are spread fairly and equally. We can do much more to ensure that people actually pay the taxes they owe. And if they illegally hide their money in various tax havens, they might have to go to prison for it. We can do much more to raise productivity by investing in education and lifelong learning. We can do much more to make sure that when people have a decent income, they can also have a decent quality of life, which means, for example, in cities like San Francisco, ensuring that we actually build more housing units so that people can afford somewhere to live. That's one point. The other point is about the creation of that equal multi-ethnic society. Now, I think it's quite tempting for many people to either say nationalism has been so dangerous and has led to so many wars that we should leave it behind in the century and it's so cruelly shaped, the 20th century. And some people have a temptation of saying, well, you know, perhaps we should celebrate all kinds of identity groups at the subnational level, but we should be very careful about all of the symbols of a nation because they've historically been associated with great injustice. And I understand both of those instincts. But my sense is that nationalism is a kind of half wild beast. That if you leave it on its own, the worst kinds of people are going to come and stoke it and bait it until it runs wild and destroys everything. And so instead, the best we can do is to try and tame it. And the way to do that is to fight for an inclusive nationalism, in which we stand up without footnote and without reservation, without apology, for minority groups that are being victimized, in which we insist on the fact that they obviously are a full and integral part of a nation, equal to everybody else, but in which we also emphasize what unites rather than divides us across racial and ethnic and religious lines, in which we actually say that there's something good about the kind of solidarity that comes with being fellow members of a nation. Because nationalism can give me a reason, for example, to look at Houston, which is far away, and say when there's a big hurricane there, I actually care about the victims and I want to go and help them. And by the way, if there's a big storm in Puerto Rico, that's the same. I also care about that. And finally, you know, in terms of how to deal with social media, the temptation is to censor what people can say on social media. Now, I do think that we need to regulate social media in various ways, and the government has a role to play in that, and it certainly has a role to play in ensuring, for example, that our data is safe when we share it with companies. But I don't think that censorship is the right way to go. I don't think that limiting what people can say online is the right way to go. What we should do is to actually fight for our values. From Plato to Aristotle and from Rousseau to the founding fathers, each set of thinkers who actually engaged with how to make a self-governing republic work really emphasized the need to transmit our values from one generation to the next. And we don't take that seriously enough anymore. The amount of civics lessons that are taught in high schools has plummeted in the past decades. People at universities, people like me who teach in a college, we don't think of our job as actually telling people the values of our political system. We spend our time pointing out its flaws. And that's fine. There's many flaws, and we should be upfront about them, and we should think together with our students about how we can go and fix some of them. But we also need to emphasize why it is that it's still better to be a citizen of the United States or of Germany or of Sweden or of Italy than it is to be a citizen of Russia or of China or of Hungary or of Venezuela. And so I think we need to much more proactively fight for the values of our political system.
So, Yascha, I wanted you to go through those three solutions for this rise of populism and the types of governments that they bring about. But surely you recognize how difficult all of those are. When you talk about raising, you know, a politician coming forth and saying we're going to raise taxes to be able to do some of these issues, to deal with some of these issues, or find where your tax havens are and put you in jail. That we're going to increase our educational offerings and move into a field of civics in a much more concentrated and conscious way to try and build a citizenry that's informed and prepared to participate in our daily politics, and whether it's local or at a national or an even international level. These are I mean, I'm being quite honest here. It seems like quite a difficult task to achieve. I can see how you could pull off some of those things, but you're saying we need to pull off all of them to be able to confront what we're really facing right now, which is this pernicious and very real present danger that exists around the world. How optimistic are you that we can get to that point, given what is occurring on a daily basis?
Well, first of all, I just want to say, look, if political and financial elites in this country are going to say, you know, making sure that people actually pay their taxes is just too hard, you know, this is unrealistic, then they don't really deserve our support. I mean, you know, it should be the minimum that people pay the taxes that they are legally obliged to pay. At the moment, the IRS keeps having its funding cut, and it has very few people actually devoted to investigating some of the you know, most affluent people who might be trying to hide the money, in some of the corporations that are trying to shield the money in various ways. And we think it's unrealistic to actually increase the funding for that and make sure that people are held to account just as anybody who goes and sticks up the next door is hopefully held to account. Then I think we're just aiming too low. And I'm not that fatalistic about it. But look, it's true that I can't promise you a happy end, right? I mean,
okay.
I don't know how this political era is going to end, right? We're at the beginning of a populist era, and it may be that we manage to stand up to it. It's quite possible that we're at the beginning of the end of the era of liberal democracy. What I do know is that that answer hasn't been written yet. It depends in good part on what we do. It depends on whether political and financial elites realize that the system from which they profit handily is now in real danger, and the minimum they can do is things like actually ensure that people pay their taxes. But it also depends on what all of us do. I went to a talk about half a year ago by the writer Amos Oz.
Yes.
And he said, look, there's this big fire burning outside in the world. And all we have is a little glass of water. And that can feel hopeless. It can feel like there's not much we can do. But you know what? There's a whole bunch of us. And if each of us take the glass of water and pour it on the fire, then together, perhaps it's not enough, but it might just be enough to actually extinguish the fire. And until we know that we can't get the fire under control, it's our responsibility and our task to do what we can to extinguish it. And so that's how I think about this. And, you know, can I promise you that we're going to succeed? No. But I'm pretty sure we have an influence on what happens, so let's get to it.
Great. Well, you're in a room full of people who are clearly devoted to civic participation. They are here because they are interested in this issue, and in fact, many of them have asked questions, and so they've passed them up to me, and they, I'm sure, are all holding glasses of water ready to put out that fire. One of them, Peter Gleichenbach, asks, Secretary Madeleine Albright points to similarities between fascism's rise and current political movements. What do you think?
So, you know, I think that you can see certain similarities in some of the resentments that feed these political movements. You can certainly see the certain similarities in political tactics, in the devaluation of the opposition, in the unwillingness to recognize that anybody who disagrees with you is legitimate. But in general, I think that the word fascism obscures more than it reveals. And it's a little bit for reasons that I was mentioning earlier. That when we think fascism, we think out of Hitler, and when we think out of Hitler, we think of somebody who's quite openly opposed to democracy. But when you look around the world, in most countries, that's not how democratic governments have perished in the last years. They've perished from people who claim that they are truly democratic. People like Recep Erdogan, people like Viktor Orban, they claimed, people like Hugo Chavez for that matter, they claim that only I am truly democratic, and everybody who disagrees with me, they're the enemies of democracy, right? And so understanding the nature of that threat, I think, is obscured rather than served by thinking about fascism.
Right. There's a question that asks about the demographics of those who support populist movements. And certainly when I was in Hungary, you noticed that it was actually university students and younger folks who were much more supportive of the far right than those who had experienced life under communism and had lived through the democratic changes that had existed. Are there are you noticing any demographic realities to who is supporting the populists? Are they those who have no memory of the past, or are you noticing that they're older folks who perhaps are tired of the politics as usual?
So look, there's a real difference between countries. So far in the United States, it is mostly older people who voted for populists. It's mostly older people who voted for Donald Trump. And so I think, especially for Americans, it's tempting to assume that the young will save us. That over time, as older people who are perhaps not as comfortable with a diverse society, they leave the electorate. Younger people who are more tolerant and diverse enter the electorate, and things will get better over time. Well, I'm afraid to say that the evidence from many other countries shows that that's not necessarily the case. In France, for example, at the presidential elections a year ago, over 50% of young people voted either for the far-right populist candidate or the far-left populist candidate in the first round of the elections. When you look at the recent Italian elections, young people voted for populist parties much more than older people. The same, by the way, is true in Germany. And so I think, young people don't vote for populists when those populists aren't trying to appeal to them. And Donald Trump knew that his likely electorate was not among the young, and he made no effort to appeal to them. But it's quite easy imagining a form of populism in the United States that perhaps is a little less xenophobic, that perhaps tries to appeal to a different demographic coalition, but that also says, you know what, none of this political system is working, let's get rid of all of this, and I'm going to go and fix everything. That could be quite popular among young people. And the reasons for that are twofold. It's first of all, as you're saying, that young people don't have as much experience with those authoritarian alternatives to democracy. They have a less vivid imagination of what fascism looked like. They haven't lived through communism being a real threat, and they have very little imagination of what the Soviet Union looked like. And so they think, how bad can things get? And the second reason is that in many countries, the system has served young people as well. You have countries like the United States where housing is so expensive that young people can't aspire to have the same standard of living of their parents even if they earn decent money. You have many political systems like those in Southern Europe and to some degree in Central Europe, in which the labor market is structured in such a way that if you got a decent job 20 or 30 years ago, you have a pretty good life, you're going to have a very generous pension, but young people are left paying the price because for somebody to employ them, they can never fire them. And they have to, for each employee, pay a lot of money that goes towards current pensions. And so as a result, it is incredibly expensive and incredibly risky to hire young people, and you have youth unemployment of up to 50% in those countries. So it's no surprise that it's in those countries that young people say, hey, the system doesn't seem to be working for me.
Right. There's a question that comes in here, and it involves externalities, other countries and other players in the politics of certain nations. And in particular, this questioner asks about Vladimir Putin and his influence on populist far-right politicians, but I would also add far-left politicians in certain instances in various countries. Could you talk a little bit about how maybe not just Vladimir Putin and his attempt to affect the politics of other countries, but there's also other models in the world, for instance, in China, that are also trying to promote a type of system that doesn't necessarily, that lends itself to populism, but that also provides a model that says, look, you don't have to have a liberal democracy to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in terms of systemic alternatives, until a few years ago, I thought that the good news was that there isn't anybody to emulate. I mean, China works very well in practice, but it's a mess in theory. Which is to say that, unless you happen to have a communist party kicking around in your country that has been in place for 50 years and has then strangely transformed into a hyper-capitalist party, it's very difficult to emulate China. What does that mean for a country that doesn't have that particular history? But I think populism is that alternative model. There is now a populist playbook, and there's a set of ideas about how that society looks, and that can be imported by democracies quite easily. And that's quite scary. Now, in terms of outside political influence, there are obviously countries in the world that have deep interest in destabilizing democracies and in trying to get the allies within those democracies elected. Russia has financed populist parties throughout Europe, often a left populist party and a right populist party in the same country at the same time. They have tried to influence the American election. I don't know whether or not they made the difference in the American election. That's difficult to tell. But I think we can recognize two things at the same time. Namely, first of all, that we need to be much more energetic in trying to close down Russia's ability to take sides in our domestic politics. And at the same time, that this isn't all that happened in 2016. That even if Russia somehow made the difference of those 80,000 votes in 3 states, in a healthy, functioning democratic system, somebody like Donald Trump would never have come within striking distance of a presidency. So there's this fake debate about this a little bit that I see, where some people are saying, oh, it's all about Russia, let's not worry about the other things, and the other people are saying, oh, you're just blaming Russia because you don't want to admit that there's other problems. Well, I think this is a false binary. You can both recognize that it's a real problem if foreign powers are trying to influence our elections, especially if you think that a country like China has actually much more capacity and much more ability to do that in the future, and they might start to emulate what Russia did. And at the same time, you can recognize that if some things in our system weren't screwed up, it wouldn't be so easy for outside actors like Russia to have the influence they do.
And just before I go to the next question, I would argue, and I think the ancients argued this as well, that there are inherent vulnerabilities in these democratic systems, that in fact they are set up. If you aren't being watchful, or if your institutions haven't been built, that you haven't developed a robust populace that's willing to participate, whether it be in military activities or in other aspects of civic life, that in fact democratic systems sow the seeds of their own demise.
Yeah, so, I think there's an inherent danger in modern democracies. So there's a beautiful essay by Benjamin Constant, a 19th century French political theorist, that emphasized the distinction between what he called the liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns. And his point was that in the ancient world, in ancient Athens, people had the freedom of ruling themselves very directly. Everybody would come together and decide on what happened in minute detail. But it also restricted the amount of freedom that people had. Famously, a musician in Athens was not allowed to add an extra string to his lyre without asking for permission from the People's Assembly. Right? So that freedom had a very high price, which is that you didn't have that kind of individual freedom. Now, our political system does promise that, and that's important. We don't want to have to ask the government whether we're allowed to add another string to our lyre. That's not our idea of politics. And in many ways, our idea of politics is that we can be free from politics. That as a private citizen, you can say, you know what, I don't care about politics, leave me alone. I just want to play Xbox, or I just want to raise my family, or I just want to, sing songs. Yeah. And that's a beautiful thing in our country that's actually important to defend. But the danger of it is that if the citizenry becomes so disengaged and becomes so little knowledgeable about politics that a demagogue, a dictator can arise, then eventually they'll take those liberties that we so prize away from us.
Yeah.
And that is the one problem of our political system. But we need to preserve the freedom to say, I don't want to bother with politics. And by the way, I think the candidate who wins hands down in 2020 against Donald Trump is the candidate that says, every Monday that you've gone to a bar for the last 4 years, you wanted to talk about college football and you've had to talk about the president instead. I promise to you, if I'm elected, you won't have to think about politics for 4 years. But we also need to keep a citizenry engaged so that they're ever vigilant to defend their liberties when it becomes the hour that that's necessary.
Yeah. You know, for years I argued when we were overseas, people would look at the United States, they say, well, look at your low voter turnout. Nobody really participates. I say, that is a sign of the strength of our politics. The fact that actually, regardless of who wins, you have a certain level of momentum and a certain level of trust that those institutions are solid, strong, and that, in fact, you can be, to some degree, apathetic because you knew that it was going to remain within a certain level of within a certain structure, reliable. But as you say, that luxury is now long gone, and I'm looking forward to a high voter turnout in all our future elections. We have a question here that says, we've seen some far-right leaders defeated. Shouldn't this allay some of our fears? And in fact, I would add to this that in the last few weeks, we saw the rise of the populists in Slovakia, in Bratislava and other parts of the country, really overthrow their leadership. This populist leader, Robert Fico, who was their prime minister, as a result of a murder that occurred to a journalist, but that it was really a governmental and really the relationship between corruption and the government that finally came to a head through this murder that led people to the streets and got them to overthrow their government. I know you mentioned earlier that you have to also build institutions. You just can't come out to the street and burn it all down. You actually have to build something. But as this questioner says, shouldn't there be isn't there some sign of where our fears should be allayed?
Well, so in 2011, the Americans sometimes think that they've invented people like Donald Trump. Italians would counter that they had Silvio Berlusconi long before. Speak of a man who's a real estate billionaire, who has a number of sex scandals, who has an extravagant hairstyle. Many similarities. And Silvio Berlusconi was in government for about 20 years. I mean, on and off, but he was the dominating political figure in the country. He had a very bad record in government, and yet he kept being elected. Well, in 2011, his luck finally seemed to have run out. The economy was doing terribly. There was a lot of pressure for him to resign. He was extremely unpopular, and finally he did. An amateur orchestra and choir hastily assembled in the middle of Rome in front of thousands of people to do an impromptu rendition of Handel's Hallelujah. Italy seemed to have turned a page. Well, 7 years later, Silvio Berlusconi is back, the kingmaker in Italian politics again, and two other populist movements are actually more influential, more powerful than him now. The Five Star Movement, that has quite a radical opposition to representative democracy and, by the way, strong links to Russia, and the Northern Leagues, which is deeply xenophobic and, by the way, has strong links to Russia. Between them, Berlusconi, the League, and Five Star have nearly 2/3 of the vote. So it is tempting to think that populists will be thrown out of office if they're not very effective. But in most countries around the world, the experience has been that they have amazing longevity. Think of a country like Peru, where Fujimori was chronicled to have taken huge bribes, thrown in prison. He's now been pardoned and looks set to become the most powerful politician in the country again. So populism often has a long lifetime, and even once one populist is rejected by the people, they can often transfer their sympathies to another populist rather than saying, you know what, perhaps we should go back to more moderate, more traditional politics. So there are some inspiring examples of people standing up against particular populists. There are some democratic countries that have righted the ship. It is absolutely possible. But it would be a big mistake to assume that will happen automatically, or that in fact is the usual course of action.
Right. Well, you are in a room full of San Franciscans who are quite active in their politics here and who are also looking for optimism in the world because the sun shines so regularly here in California. We have, I know you're in London. We have a little bit more of a brighter orientation, I think, towards our daily life, and so it's not surprising that it would be reflected in some of our questions, because there's one who asks if there are any government models in practice that closely embody the solutions you present. Are there some places around the world that are inoculating themselves because they're able to fill their state coffers and have the resources that they need, that are able to pass along a civic education and civics within their schools, who are able to manage the challenges of social media and able to come up with a politics of pragmatism and one that is less vulnerable to this populist virus which is occurring around the world.
So I don't think that there's one politician or one government or one country that has gotten it all right, but I do think that you can see the success of elements of the political program that I'm talking about in different places. I think, for example, that some Northern European countries aren't immune to populism, but they've been able to keep populism at slightly lower rates because they've done a lot more to make sure that their citizens actually partake in economic growth. In a country like Sweden, the living standard of average workers has actually improved by 40 or 50% in the last couple of decades. And I think it does buy the government a sort of residual trust, without which, given the strongly contentious issue of immigration in the country, the populists would probably be doing much better than they are. I think that here in the United States, now you can see this one way or the other, but I think as long as a strongly inclusive patriotism was on offer, it was quite politically effective. I think that is what Barack Obama embodied and fought for, I think, more convincingly in various ways than Hillary Clinton, and it's one of the reasons why he did get elected twice. So I would say that there are good empirical cases in which you can see some of this working, but there's no silver bullet, and there's no country that has gotten all of it right.
Well, there's an extension to this question, and it applies more to this country, because one of our audience members is curious to know whether you see any possibility of Democratic Party leadership in the U.S. offering specific solutions to the needs of people in the middle and the ever-growing number of independent voters.
So look, it's hard to answer to offer all of these answers, and the Democratic Party, by its nature, is a broad tent, and I think that comes from our political system, right? If you want to cover about 50% of Americans, which is what you have to do in order to be politically effective, you have to run a pretty ideologically broad range of candidates. And since I think it's incredibly important that we reestablish some real amount of balance of power in the federal system, and by the way, in some of the state houses around the country as well, I'm all in favor of that. Now, I do think that there's a whole bunch of issues which aren't necessarily ideologically radical, on which Democrats should push much harder. There are issues which are actually quite popular across the country, in which they have to have a courage of their convictions and sometimes listen a little less to their donors. But you know what? I think the Democratic Party is making more progress towards some of those positions and more progress towards an ambitious political program than we're sometimes tempted to admit. I think there's a tendency on big parts of the left of sort of, assuming that we're screwed anyway, and everything is going to be bad, and our politicians are going to sell us out in any case. And while we should definitely push our politicians to be accountable and to be more imaginative and to in many ways be more radical about actually living their values, I don't think we should be fatalistic, or that we should sort of take every little defeat as another piece of evidence that the Democratic Party has sort of, betrayed its base and so on.
Okay, so there is hope for the Democratic Party to actually revivify these politics. the last question that I'll read is one that actually goes beyond the nation-state question and wants to look at international institutions. And maybe if there's any hope that we can look to beyond what we see that occurs within nations, which is this rise of populism, this understanding, whether it be because of the threat of global warming that forces nations to work together, or because there are institutions in place already that at least provide a framework for finding solutions and perhaps the ability to rise above populist nation states. And in particular, the question here is about the United Nations, whose charter was signed here in San Francisco.
I'm well aware. Well, I must tell you, if you want somebody to really breathe fire about the United Nations and tell you how horribly dysfunctional it is and how it needs to be abolished, you need to go and speak to somebody who works for the United Nations. But I think that these organizations often have some real problems in the way they're organized and they function. And more importantly, I don't think that they are insulated from national politics. They have member states that are very powerful. And when you have politicians at the national level who believe, as many populists do, that international affairs are a zero-sum game, that in order for me to win, you have to lose, it's very difficult for them to work effectively. The problem with the UN Security Council is, not so much, it needs reform and so on, but ultimately the problem is that when you have China and Russia and the United States represented at the table, you're not going to come to agreement about much at the moment.
Right.
And there's no silver bullet to fix that. There's no way around that. In fact, the rise of populists, I think, is really calling in question the nature of some institutions for which people once held out real hope. When you think of an entity like the European Union, the idea was that it was going to be a club of democratic values that models what that kind of international cooperation would look like in a democratic context. Well, you now have countries who are members of the European Union that are rapidly descending into outright dictatorship. And the European Union is proving to be incredibly reluctant to call them out. Claude Juncker, the head of the European Commission, Manfred Weber, the head of the most powerful faction of the European Parliament, both called up Viktor Orban to congratulate him on his supposed electoral victory, which according to the OSCE was not a fair and square electoral victory at all. And they are not punishing Hungary, they are not even expelling Viktor Orban's party Fidesz from the European People's Party, which, by the way, Angela Merkel's Christian Democrats also sit in. So if you tolerate a dictator as part of the European Union, the very nature of it starts to change. It becomes little more than a regional trade bloc of no particular normative value. And so I don't think international organizations are going to save us from those national politicians. I think those populist politicians are going to change international institutions for worse.
So before we go and close the radio part of this evening, I think it's important to understand that really, if we've got some takeaways here, it's let's fix our institutions. Everybody who can needs to get out there and participate, become informed, and make sure that we can put a stop to this rise of populism. And you have to come to San Francisco more often and give us some more hope regarding this direction. And maybe your next book will be The Death of Populism around the world.
I hope so. David Foster Wallace, in his beautiful commencement speech at Canyon, has this great opening where he describes, fish swimming in the sea, and these two older fish are sort of ambling along, and they run into these younger fish and they say, "How's the water?" And the younger fish say, "What water?" That's what our political system is like to us, right? All of us in this room, we're used to liberal democracy. We take for granted some of its great benefits. And so it's scary to suddenly realize, hey, it might go away. But if we regain the courage of our convictions, there's a lot we can do to save it. So it's our job to do that now.
I want to thank Yascha Mounk for being with us this evening. He's reminded us what it's like to swim in water, and let's keep swimming upstream. But yes, thank you. Thank you for joining us.